At dawn, the lake burned with light. Mist rolled over the high Andean plateau, veiling the ridges in silver gauze. From the valleys below came the slow throb of drums, hollow and steady, echoing off stone like a heartbeat for the mountain. The people of the Muisca moved in solemn procession toward the water, their steps measured, their faces streaked with ash and ochre. They called this place Guatavita, the navel of the world, where the breath of the gods touched the surface of the earth. At the edge of the lake, a raft waited, woven from reeds and canes, its floor spread with gold dust that shimmered like a field of sunlight. The new Zipa, the ruler of Bacatá, stood motionless at its center. His attendants had covered him with resins and fine metallic powder until his skin gleamed from crown to heel. When the first light of morning broke through the clouds, the figure on the raft glowed as if set aflame. To the Muisca, gold was not wealth. It was energy, the sweat of the sun, the pulse of creation itself. To return it to the lake was to restore balance between human and divine, between flesh and light. The priests chanted in the Chibcha tongue, their voices weaving with the flutes and hand drums, summoning the presence of Sue, the solar father, and Chia, the moon mother who watched from the sky. Anaya, high priestess of the temple, watched from the slope, her eyes lined with soot. The people said she could hear the lake speak, that in dreams she walked upon its surface and carried back messages wrapped in gold leaf. To her, the ceremony was not spectacle, it was contract. The ruler must give what shone upon him back to the source of its light. Only then would the fields bear maize, and the rains arrive in rhythm. The raft drifted from the shore. Ripples bent the reflections of mountains into trembling arcs. The golden man lifted his hands and spoke the vow of the Zipa, words so old that only the priests knew their full meaning. The people listened as if to thunder rolling beneath the earth. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he cast handfuls of gold into the water. Figurines, bracelets, discs hammered so thin they floated for a moment before sinking into green shadow. The sound of the flutes rose. The crowd chanted his name. When the raft reached the middle of the lake, the ruler bent his knees and plunged. For a heartbeat, he vanished beneath the surface. The crowd gasped. Then he rose again, the golden film washing from his skin like light extinguished by dawn. The ritual was complete. The man returned to the world of mortals. The gold remained with the gods. Father Alvaro Ruiz, then a young friar newly arrived from Seville, stood at the edge of the throng, hidden beneath his cowl. He had traveled for months to reach the plateau, driven by curiosity more than duty. He had heard the rumors whispered along the Caribbean coast, tales of a king covered in gold dust who bathed in a sacred lake. But the truth, what he saw that morning, was nothing like the greed-soaked stories told in taverns. It was beautiful, terrible, holy. He wrote later in his journal, "The sun fell upon that man as upon an altar. I felt my heart tremble, not for his gold, but for his faith." The Spaniards would twist that vision into something monstrous. Within a generation, the golden man became the golden city. The act of giving became a promise of hidden hoards. But on that morning, on the mirror of Guatavita, there was only silence and the slow return of mist. Anaya approached Father Alvaro after the crowd had dispersed. Her gaze was sharp, unafraid. "You watched," she said in halting Spanish, "learned from traders who brought salt and cloth." "I did," Alvaro replied. "It was extraordinary." "It was ordinary," she corrected softly. "We have done it for longer than your God has walked your lands." He hesitated. "Your king, he gives away what your people might need." She smiled faintly. "What we give returns. The lake keeps us alive. If we keep what belongs to the sun, the rains will die." Alvaro noted her words carefully. He had been sent to convert, to bring light to what Spain called darkness. Yet here, beneath the thin mountain sky, he felt that the light already belonged to them. That night, as the fires along the lakeshore dwindled, Alvaro wandered alone. He found the raft pulled onto the mud, its gold dust rinsed away. The air smelled of resin and smoke. He knelt and touched the water. It was cold as glass. From the dark, Anaya's voice came again. "You think this is about gold?" He turned. She stood in the shallows, her hair glistening with mist. "It's about faith," he said. She nodded. "Then remember that, when your brothers come." The next day, Alvaro began the journey back to the coast. He carried with him a small wooden cross, and a single gold figurine that one of the children had pressed into his palm, a tiny man with arms outstretched toward the sky. Years later, that figure would sit on the desk of a governor in Cartagena, proof, he claimed, that somewhere inland there existed a kingdom of gold. Decades passed. Stories mutated. Sailors spoke of lakes filled with treasure, of temples paved in yellow metal. The word El Dorado began to circulate, not as a man, but as a place. Each telling added another detail. Golden walls, rivers lined with emeralds, palaces that gleamed brighter than Seville itself. It was a story built to be believed. When the first Spanish columns pushed into the Andes, Father Alvaro, now grey-haired and half lame, followed them once more. Not as missionary this time, but as recorder. He feared what the myth would become. But that is another chapter. Before the conquistadors came, the Muisca world thrived in balance. Villages spread across the savannas, their roofs thatched with reeds, their markets thick with the smell of salt and maize. They traded not with coins but with trust, salt cakes for feathers, copper for coca leaves. Every few seasons, delegations travelled to the sacred lake bearing gifts. The goldsmiths worked for months crafting tunjos, small votive figures cast in the lost wax method, each one a prayer shaped by hand. Anaya oversaw these offerings. She taught her apprentices to melt the alloy called tumbaga, to mix gold with copper until it glowed like fire, yet stayed strong enough to hold form. Each piece represented a bond between the people and their gods. To melt it again was to release its spirit. Everything bright returns to the sun, she told them. When the Spaniards finally climbed to the plateau, they saw none of that meaning. They saw only glitter. They recorded what they thought they understood. A lord who coats himself in gold and bathes in a lake that hides untold wealth. The words crossed oceans faster than truth could follow. In Seville's port taverns, men boasted that they would find the city of El Dorado before the year was out. Bankers funded expeditions. Priests blessed banners. Soldiers sharpened swords. And in the high valleys, the people of the lake began to hide their gold. One night, years after the first rumours had reached Spain, Anaya stood again upon the rim of Guatavita. The stars trembled on its surface like coins. She felt the world tilting. She had dreamed of ships with wings of cloth, of men whose skin burned under the sun, of crosses raised above smoking temples. She knelt and whispered to the water. "They are coming." From far below, the lake murmured back. The ripples spread outward, soft and infinite. Father Alvaro's final memory of that place came long after the lake had been scarred by foreign hands. He would recall the first morning always the same way. The way gold had looked when it was not yet greed, when it was only light dancing on skin. He would remember the face of Anaya, half in shadow, saying, "Remember this when your brothers come." And he would remember how, for one breathless instant, it had seemed the sun itself had risen from the water. Years later, when he was old and near death, he would tell a young novice in a candlelit cell in Bogotá, "I saw the beginning of a legend. I saw it before men turned it into hunger." The boy would ask, "What was it, father? A city?" "No," he would whisper. "A man who gave everything back." The novice would frown, confused. The father would smile faintly. "They will not believe that part," he said. "They will remember only the gold." Outside, the rain would fall upon the tiles of the convent roof, echoing like drums from another age. Centuries later, scholars would recover fragments of Alvaro Ruiz's journal. The pages smelled of smoke and salt. In one entry, nearly erased by time, he had written, "At dawn, the lake burned with light, and I understood what paradise costs. The world does not crave faith, it craves the proof of faith, and gold, alas, glitters like proof." The handwriting faltered toward the end, as if the ink had thickened. The final line read simply, "She was right." They came. Back on the plateau, the lake still waits. Wind moves across it in slow waves, bending the grass, carrying whispers that sound like the low pulse of flutes. Somewhere beneath its surface, buried under centuries of silt, the offerings still lie. Tunjos of gold, emerald beads, the likeness of a man standing upon a raft. The world calls it myth. The people who remember call it memory. And when dawn breaks and the sun strikes the water, for a brief, blinding moment, the lake burns again with light, just as it did the morning the Golden One rose from its heart and gave everything away. The heat in Cartagena clung to the skin like syrup. Ships moored in the harbor creaked beneath their own weight, their bellies swollen with silver from Mexico, slaves from Africa, and rumors from every corner of the New World. Men drank under canvas awnings and spoke of a legend that had no map. El Dorado, the land of eternal gold. Gonzalo Jimenez de Quesada listened. He was not a young man anymore, but ambition refused to age. Once a lawyer, now a soldier, he had served in the conquest of Santa Marta and had tasted just enough success to believe he was chosen. He stood on the dock, his armor dulled by salt, watching the sun melt into the sea. Behind him, banners bearing the Red Cross of Castile fluttered in the wind. Beyond the mountains, a sailor rasped. A kingdom richer than Peru. The king himself covered in gold. The lake that eats treasure. Quesada's lips curved into something between a smile and a wound. Then that is where we go. Father Alvaro Ruiz, older now and weary from missions among the coastal tribes, was summoned to bless the expedition. He saw the fever in their eyes, the same fever that had turned Pizarro's men into butchers in Peru. Yet he also saw his own weakness, curiosity, the same spark that had led him years ago to the lake of Guatavita. They set out in the dry season of 1536. 700 soldiers marched from Santa Marta into the Sierra Nevada, dragging cannons through mud and mangrove. The jungle swallowed sound, heat pressing down like a hand. Mosquitoes clouded the air, armor rusted overnight, horses collapsed from thirst. Alvaro kept a journal. They speak of gold as if it were grace. They believe it will absolve them. At night, the men dreamed aloud. Some swore they had heard native slaves whisper of a city built on the bones of the sun. Others claimed they had seen flakes of gold glittering in the river mud. The captain encouraged every lie. Weeks turned into months. Half the men died. Food ran out. They ate their horses, then their dogs, then boiled leather from their belts. But one morning, from the ridge of a high valley, they saw it. A vast green savanna stretched beneath a sky clean as glass. Smoke curled from villages. The land seemed tamed, ordered, promising. "This is Bacata," said one of their Indian guides. "The kingdom of the Zipa," Quesada grinned. "Then we have found El Dorado." They descended like locusts. The Muisca met them, not with spears, but with confusion. They offered salt-cloth food. They had never seen armor that shone or guns that spat thunder. Quesada demanded their gold. They gave trinkets, ornaments, small figures, tokens of worship. The captain laughed. There must be more. Father Alvaro tried to explain, haltingly, that to these people gold was not coin but prayer. The captain dismissed him. Then let their prayers fund the crown. Villages burned. Temples were stripped. The smell of maize and smoke filled the air. Alvaro walked through the ruins, his cassock scorched at the hem. He found a child clutching a melted gold figurine, its head broken off. The boy stared without sound. Alvaro knelt, but the child flinched away as if from fire. That night, he dreamed of Anaya. She stood beside the lake, her eyes reflecting starlight. "Remember what I told you," she whispered. "When your brothers come." He woke to the crack of gunfire. Quesada pressed onward. His army split into smaller companies, each seeking the mythical capital. The highlands were cold, mist coiled between peaks like smoke from unseen fires. The soldiers began to call the place La Tierra de Fantasmas, the land of ghosts. In a ruined temple, they found a mural showing a man covered in gold standing on a raft. The image, faded but unmistakable, confirmed every rumor. The captain ordered the site torn apart in search of treasure. They found none, only bones wrapped in woven cloth and jars of maize. Still, Quesada declared, the city is near. They reached the lake of Guatavita at the end of the rainy season. The water lay still as metal, the slopes around it scarred by their fires. Alvaro tried to stop them, but the captain would not listen. "Here it is," Quesada proclaimed. "The mouth of the treasure." He ordered trenches dug, men with buckets and leather sacks to bail water day and night. They built wooden ramps, tried to drain the lake through tunnels carved by pickaxes. Weeks passed. The water only rose again. They did find gold, small pieces, offerings that had been lying for centuries in the mud, tiny figures, frogs, serpents, birds with outstretched wings. It was enough to feed the madness. The soldiers fought over the fragments. Knives flashed in the moonlight. One man drowned reaching for a glint beneath the surface. The next morning, they dragged his body from the water, his fingers locked around a lump of metal, no bigger than a coin. Father Alvaro buried him himself. he wrote. The lake gives back what we deserve, nothing more. As months turned to years, 3 expeditions converged upon the high plateau. Quesada from the north, Federman from the east, and Belalcázar from the south. Each claimed the land in the name of their own governor, their own god, their own greed. They met near the valley of Bogotá. The scene was chaos. 3 armies staring at one another, gaunt and fevered, their banners tattered. For a week they argued, traded insults, even exchanged fire. Then, when they realized there was no city, no fortress of gold, only villages of farmers and lakes of silence, they sat around the same fire and divided what little they had stolen. Quesada returned to Cartagena with a handful of idols, some emeralds, and his legend intact. The crown rewarded him with titles but no fortune. He would die nearly penniless, still insisting he had once stood at the edge of paradise. Father Alvaro returned to his cell. He could not pray. His God seemed far away, hidden behind smoke. But the fever did not die with Quesada. It grew. In the ports of Spain, his reports fed new dreams. Chroniclers exaggerated, merchants embellished, and soon El Dorado became not a city, but a continent, an entire world waiting to be seized. New captains prepared their ships. New priests readied their blessings. Among them was a man named Gonzalo Pizarro, brother of the conqueror of Peru, and a restless soldier named Francisco de Orellana. They would chase the golden phantom east toward the rivers that ran to the unknown. Alvaro watched them depart from Quito years later, leaning on his staff. The old friar tried to warn them. There is no city, he said. Only a mirror that shows what you want most. Pizarro laughed. Then let it show me everything. In the months before his death, Alvaro compiled his journals, sending them by mule to Seville. He hoped someone would read and understand. But his words would be stripped of caution, mined for marvels. Printers in Spain sold his accounts under new titles. The Discovery of the Golden Kingdom, The Mirror of Heaven. Readers devoured them. He became the accidental herald of the very madness he had tried to condemn. Back on the high plains, the Muisca rebuilt what they could. The temples stood empty, their gold stripped. The lake of Guatavita lay quiet, scarred by trenches that filled again with rain. Yet sometimes at dawn, mist would rise from its surface, and the villagers would say they heard the sound of flutes under the water, the echo of a ceremony long silenced. One evening, as Alvaro lay dying, a young novice came to his bedside with a question. "Father, is El Dorado real?" Alvaro smiled weakly. "Yes, I have seen it. Then where is it?" He looked past the boy, toward the window where the last light of day spilled across the floor like molten gold. "It was never a place," he whispered. "It was a fever." Yet across the ocean, that fever blazed brighter than ever. Poets wrote of a city where streets gleamed like dawn. Mapmakers inked vast lakes upon parchment. The promise of gold became a prayer in itself, one that no priest could contain. And in the silence of the Andes, the lake waited again, patient as a god, reflecting clouds and men alike, each chasing the shimmer of his own desire. When the rains came, they washed away the last traces of the Spanish camps. Grass covered the trenches. In the villages, children played with stones where idols had once stood. The old people said that one day the lake would close its mouth forever, sealing the greed of men beneath its mirror. But others whispered that the lake was alive, that it remembered. It had accepted the offerings of faith. Now it collected the offerings of folly. Some nights, travelers claimed to see a shape moving across the surface, a man of light standing upon a raft, raising his hands toward the stars. Whether it was the spirit of the old Zipa or merely the reflection of lightning, no one could say. Father Alvaro's last line, found among his papers, read, "They came seeking gold and found themselves, but none could bear what they saw." In the years that followed, the story would drift down every river, carried by tongues eager for wonder. It would change again, each retelling brighter, crueler, more absurd. El Dorado became not just a rumor, but a promise. The purest lie ever told, because it was also the truest wish of men. And somewhere in the heart of the new world, beneath clouds heavy with rain, the lake of Guatavita still gleamed, waiting for the next dreamer to mistake its light for salvation. Fog clung to the ridges like ghosts reluctant to leave. The air on the high plateau was thin, filled with the scent of wet grass and smoke from dying fires. The soldiers called it the Valley of the Gods, though no god they knew had ever answered them here. Their armor was streaked with rust, their faces hollow from months of hunger. They had reached the end of the world, or so they believed, and still the city of gold refused to appear. Gonzalo Jimenez de Quesada rode at the front, his horse gaunt, its ribs showing through the hide. Around him shuffled men who no longer looked like conquerors, but like pilgrims lost in a maze of green. They carried shards of gold and a handful of emeralds, relics taken from the Mesca villages they had burned. It was enough to keep their fever alive, but not enough to save their souls. Father Alvaro Ruiz followed on foot, staff tapping the stones. He was thinner now, older. His hair, once black as ink, had turned the colour of ashes. The journal he kept under his cloak had grown heavy with damp pages. He wrote whenever he could, though the ink often ran from the rain. "We have found no city," he recorded, "only hearts that believe in one. The gold they carry blinds them more than the mist. They camped by a river, its waters clouded with silt." The captain called for mass. Alvaro raised the chalice with trembling hands, the sun piercing through the fog like a blade of fire. The soldiers knelt, heads bowed, muttering prayers that sounded like bargaining. When the service ended, Quesada took the priest aside. "You have seen the murals, the offerings," the captain said. "You know there is more. A city does not vanish." "Perhaps it was never built of stone," Alvaro answered. Quesada's eyes narrowed. "You mean to say it is myth?" "I mean to say it is faith, Captain." "Faith fills no coffers." The priest looked past him toward the mountains. "Nor does greed." Quesada turned away, muttering a curse. That night he ordered the men to march east. The farther they travelled, the more the land seemed to dissolve. Valleys became swamps, and the paths vanished beneath vines. The guides they had taken from the Muisca villages whispered that beyond the next ridge lay another lake, larger than Guatavita, where the gods themselves hid their treasure. The men cheered. Alvaro did not. Days later they found the lake, but it was a swamp, thick with reeds and mosquitoes, its surface black as tar. They tried to wade into it and sank knee-deep in muck. One man disappeared altogether, swallowed with a cry. The others dragged themselves back to shore, shivering with fear. Still, Quesada refused to give up. He promised his men that fortune lay just beyond, that the city waited for those who endured. He sent out scouts in every direction. Few returned. Those who did spoke of ruins glimpsed in the distance, of strange lights flickering on hilltops. Each tale contradicted the last. It was as if the land itself were mocking them. One evening Alvaro climbed a ridge alone. From its crest, he saw the valley spread below him like a green sea. Smoke rose from what remained of a Muisca settlement, the last trace of life in a world now silent. In the fading light, he thought he saw movement by the river, a figure draped in white, standing motionless on a rock. He descended quickly, heart pounding. When he reached the riverbank, there was nothing but mist. Yet on the stone where the figure had stood lay a small gold amulet shaped like a sun. He picked it up. The metal was warm to the touch. That night by the fire, he showed it to Quesada. "A sign," the captain said. "We are close," Alvaro said nothing. He knew what he had seen, or believed he had seen, but he also knew how easily hope could forge its own ghosts. By the time they reached the valley of Bogotá, the three expeditions had already converged. Quesada from the north, Federman from the east, and Belalcázar from the south. The encounter was chaos. Each commander claimed the territory for his own governor, his own crown, his own god. Their flags fluttered over opposing camps, separated by a stream no wider than a street. For a week they shouted at each other across the water. Then the shouting became gunfire. Powder smoke drifted through the fog, mingling with the smell of blood. Dozens fell. But when they counted their dead and their spoils, they realized the truth. There was nothing left to fight for. No city, no gold, only the endless wind sweeping across the plateau. That night, beneath a sky bruised with storm, the three men met in a ruined temple. They sat on cracked stone steps, each wrapped in his own bitterness. "So this is El Dorado," Belalcázar muttered. Quesada laughed, hollow. "A kingdom of dust." Federman said nothing. He stared into the darkness where lightning flashed behind the mountains. Father Alvaro watched them, feeling a weight settle over him heavier than any armor. He understood now. The city had always existed, just not here. It lived inside them, a hunger wearing the mask of faith. He left the temple before dawn. A few miles from the camp, he found the remnants of another village. Charred huts, scattered bones. In one hut, a child's drawing burned into the wall. A man standing in a circle of fire, arms raised toward the sun. The lines were crude but unmistakable, the same image he had seen years ago on the raft at Guatavita. He knelt in the ashes and whispered a prayer not for the dead, but for the living. Then he heard a voice behind him. "You still look for her," it said. He turned. Anaya stood there, or something that wore her face. Her hair was streaked with grey, her skin thin as bark, yet her eyes were unchanged, deep as the lake itself. "I look for truth," he said. "Truth is what men kill when they are afraid. They will not listen to me. They will listen to gold," she said softly. "Always gold." He blinked, and she was gone. When he returned to the camp, the soldiers were already preparing to march. They had heard new rumors of a river that flowed east into a land of cinnamon and gold. Quesada's eyes shone again with fever. "Beyond those mountains," he said, pointing into the mist. "That is where the real El Dorado lies." Alvaro felt the last of his faith fracture. Months later, he stood once more at the lake of Guatavita. The trenches had begun to fill with water, turning the ground into a mire. Broken tools lay scattered like bones. The wind carried the faint scent of rain and decay. He opened his journal and wrote by the dim light of the clouds. "The city we seek is not made of stone or gold, but of longing. We build it each time we believe that what we desire must be real, simply because we desire it." He closed the book and set it on a rock. Then he took the amulet he had found by the river and cast it into the lake. It vanished without a sound. In the years that followed, he would tell others what he had seen. Some called him liar, others saint. The chronicles of the conquest recorded his words, but twisted them into proof that the city existed. The myth, now freed from fact, grew wings. And so it happened that while the true Guatavita lay silent, cartographers in Spain began to draw new lakes on their maps, each more golden than the last. Every blank space on the parchment became another promise, another place where El Dorado might hide. The priests preached that God had hidden riches to test men's faith. The crown decreed that whoever found the city would earn eternal glory. And somewhere in the jungles of South America, men sharpened swords and whispered prayers to a god made of metal. Father Alvaro withdrew to a monastery in Tunja. He rarely spoke. When novices asked him about the conquest, he would only say, "We found what we were looking for, and it nearly destroyed us." Sometimes at dusk, he would climb the tower and look east. On clear evenings, he thought he saw a glimmer beyond the horizon, a flash of gold against the green. He knew it was only the sun setting behind clouds, but still he watched until the light faded. One of the young brothers once found him asleep at his desk, his hands stained with ink, the journal open to a single line written in an unsteady hand. The city was never there, but the madness was. Meanwhile, across oceans, new names rose: Francisco de Orellana, Gonzalo Pizarro, Lope de Aguirre, men who would chase the same mirage down new rivers, deeper into the jungle, where even maps dared not go. The legend had escaped its birthplace. It would travel with them through fever and blood, whispering the same promise that had once lured Quesada across the mountains, that somewhere just beyond the next horizon lay salvation cast in gold. And though Father Alvaro would never see those men again, he sensed their fate. He wrote one last note in the margin of his book. Once a story learns to walk, it never dies. It only changes the names of those it consumes. He closed the journal, sealed it with wax, and placed it beneath the floorboards of his cell. The next morning, the brothers found him kneeling before the altar, head bowed, hands clasped around a small gold cross that gleamed faintly in the dawn light. Outside, the sun rose over the mountains, spilling its fire across the valley, and for a fleeting instant the clouds turned the color of molten metal, reminding the world once more of a city that wasn't there. Rain fell without end. It drummed on the leaves, the tents, the helmets of men who had long forgotten the sound of silence. The jungle breathed around them, thick, steaming, alive. Vines hung like serpents, trees towered higher than cathedrals, their roots writhing across the mud. Every step was a prayer to survive. It was 1541 when Gonzalo Pizarro, brother of the conqueror of Peru, marched east from Quito in search of El Dorado. The rumors had changed shape again. Now the city was said to lie beyond the mountains, in a land of cinnamon and gold, guarded by rivers that glowed beneath the sun. Pizarro led 200 soldiers, 4,000 natives, and a handful of friars, including Father Alvaro Ruiz, whose curiosity once more defeated his fear. From the first day, the expedition felt cursed. The rains came early, turning the trails into rivers. Horses slipped and broke their legs. Food spoiled. Men argued over maps that showed nothing but blank space. At night, they camped beside fires that hissed in the damp. Pizarro sat apart, sharpening his sword with slow precision. Beyond these hills lies the valley, he told his officers. There we'll find the spice trees, the gold, the city. Father Alvaro watched him, remembering the same gleam in Quesada's eyes years before. And if we find nothing? He asked. Then we keep walking until we do, Pizarro said. Weeks blurred into months. The jungle became an ocean of green. Men lost their sense of direction. The compass spun uselessly. Fever struck. The dead were left where they fell. Natives deserted at night, vanishing like smoke. Father Alvaro wrote by the flickering light of a candle. We march through a world that does not want us. The trees whisper against our armor, and the rivers carry away our faith. One morning, they reached the crest of a ridge and saw before them a vast expanse of mist. Beneath it coiled a river so broad it seemed to swallow the horizon. The guides called it the Napo. To the Spaniards it looked like salvation. Pizarro ordered the men to build rafts. We follow it east, he said. It will lead us to the Golden Lands. Among those chosen to lead the descent was Francisco de Orellana, a thin, restless soldier with eyes that caught light like metal. He was loyal enough to obey, but ambitious enough to dream. As they floated down the Napo, the current quickened. The forest closed in on both sides, branches scraping the air like claws. The water mirrored the sky so perfectly that some men swore they were sailing between two worlds, one above, one below. That night, under a canopy of stars, Orellana sat beside Father Alvaro. Do you believe the stories, priest? He asked. I believe in what men do for the sake of stories, Alvaro said. Orellana smiled faintly. Then you believe in El Dorado. I believe in the need for it, the soldier laughed. Then we are the same. By the third month, supplies had vanished. They boiled leather, roasted roots, even ate candles made of tallow. The jungle gave them fruit that looked sweet but burned the tongue like acid. Men began to whisper that the river itself was cursed, that it fed not into the sea, but into the mouth of hell. Pizarro grew paranoid. He accused his officers of hiding food, of plotting against him. The expedition fractured. When they reached a bend where the river split into two, Pizarro made a decision. He ordered Orellana to take a small detachment downstream in search of food and return within 10 days. Bring back maize or die trying, he said. Orellana saluted. And if the river carries us farther than we intend? Then may it carry you to El Dorado, Pizarro said coldly. Father Alvaro volunteered to go. He was tired of watching men devour one another with their eyes. Orellana accepted his company. They pushed off in a single brigantine with 50 men. The current seized them immediately, dragging them faster than oars could fight. The jungle walls rose higher, the light fading to a green twilight. The men rowed until their hands bled. After 2 days, they realized the truth. They could not go back. Orellana gathered the men on the deck. The current is too strong, he said. If we turn against it, we die. If we follow it, maybe we live. Father Alvaro nodded. Then we follow. So began the voyage that would carry them across the entire continent. They drifted past villages where faces stared from the shadows, eyes glinting like stones. Arrows hissed from the trees. The Spaniards fired muskets blindly, the thunder rolling through the forest like storm. When they found a burned village abandoned by its people, they discovered baskets of maize. It tasted like mercy. That night, as they ate, Alvaro gazed into the river. The surface was still, reflecting the stars so clearly that it seemed they floated between heaven and its twin. He thought of the lake of fire, of the golden man rising from its depths. This river is a mirror, he murmured. Orellana looked up. Of what? Of ourselves. Weeks passed. The men grew thin, half mad from hunger and silence. Some swore they saw lights moving beneath the water, shapes like cities glimmering below. Others claimed to hear drums from the depths, echoing their own heartbeats. One night, a soldier jumped overboard shouting that he could see the streets of El Dorado shining beneath him. The current swallowed him in seconds. His scream faded into the dark. Orellana said nothing. His eyes were fever bright. He saw it, he whispered. It's real, Father Alvaro wanted to believe, but he knew better. He saw his reflection, he said. By the time they reached the confluence with a larger river, the Amazon, they were little more than skeletons. The land had changed. Wide beaches, endless water, the sky vast and empty. The air smelled of salt. Orellana stood at the prow, hair matted with sweat, skin burned to leather. We have crossed the world, he said. If we live to tell it, they will call us discoverers. Alvaro smiled faintly. They will call you whatever their gold requires. They built new rafts from driftwood, patched sails from torn shirts, and followed the current east. Along the banks they saw tribes with painted faces, tall women who fought with bows as tall as men. The Spaniards called them Amazons, and the river inherited their name. Orellana recorded everything, his handwriting precise despite the tremor in his hand. We have found not El Dorado, he wrote, but the road to it, a river that cuts the world in half. Father Alvaro added in his own journal, perhaps El Dorado is not a place one reaches, but the journey itself, the endless hunger that keeps us moving forward. At last, after months of drifting, they reached the ocean. The men wept. Some fell to their knees, kissing the sand. Others stared in disbelief, unable to comprehend that the world had an end after all. Orellana raised his arms to the wind. "We have conquered the river!" he cried. Father Alvaro looked at the horizon, where the sun blazed like molten metal over the sea. "No," he said softly, "the river has conquered us." When news of their journey reached Spain, it was retold as triumph. The chroniclers called Orellana's voyage the discovery of the great river of the Amazons. They described the expedition as divinely guided, the men as heroes of faith. They wrote that beyond the mouth of that river lay the golden kingdom of Manoa, another name for El Dorado. Pizarro, still lost in the jungle, was forgotten. His bones would vanish into the earth. Only Father Alvaro's notes hinted at the truth. He wrote of men who dreamed themselves into madness, of water that reflected their faces until they no longer recognized them. He wrote of a city that moved like a shadow across the surface of the river, never closer, never gone. In one entry, barely legible from rain, he had written, "When we stare too long into the mirror, we forget which world is the reflection." Years later, when Alvaro returned to Quito, his body broken by fever, he was asked what he had found. He answered, "Ourselves." The listeners laughed. They wanted stories of treasure, of gods and monsters. He gave them silence. But at night, he dreamed of the river, how it had looked under moonlight, a perfect ribbon of glass stretching forever. He would see his face. In it, and behind that face, the faint shimmer of gold, like something just out of reach. And every time he tried to touch it, the image broke. In the monasteries of Spain, cartographers traced his route onto parchment. They drew winding lines that bled into oceans, marked with names half remembered. Along the edge of the Amazon, they inscribed in bold letters, "Here flows the river of El Dorado." It was not truth they mapped, but desire, and so the myth continued to grow, carried by the river's current, whispering its promise to the next generation of men who would mistake their reflection for paradise. In his final years, Father Alvaro would tell the novices of the journey. "The jungle," he said, "is a mirror made of leaves. It shows you what you carry inside. We went looking for gold and found the shadow of our own hunger staring back." The novices would ask, "Was it worth it, Father?" He would smile without mirth. Ask the river. Far away, in the heart of the Amazon, the water still moved with the slow grace of time. Fish flickered beneath its skin like sparks of gold. The canopy above mirrored the heavens so that no man could tell where earth ended and sky began. Those who sailed it after Orellana said they sometimes saw faces in the water, men of light walking upon the surface, their eyes turned toward the sun. Some said it was the ghost of the Golden King. Others swore it was only the reflection of clouds, but the river did not answer. It only flowed on, bearing the memory of all who had sought their own image in its depths. And when the wind died and the world held its breath, the surface of the river became still as glass, a perfect mirror. In it, for one fleeting heartbeat, the jungle, the sky, and the souls of men became one endless reflection of gold. The jungle was a wound that never healed. By 1560, the stories of El Dorado had twisted into fever. Every port from Seville to Lima buzzed with talk of lost cities, of lakes that swallowed treasure, of kings who slept on beds of gold. Among those who listened was Pedro de Ursua, a soldier of reputation and arrogance, chosen by the Viceroy of Peru to lead yet another search for the Golden Land. His commission was grand: 200 soldiers, a flotilla of boats, and authority over all who followed. But in the shadow of his command walked a man whose name would soon become legend. A thin, sharp-faced Basque soldier named Lope de Aguirre. He spoke softly, laughed rarely, and looked at the world as though it had already betrayed him. Father Alvaro Ruiz, older than any man aboard, had been invited, or perhaps condemned, to join the expedition as chaplain. "You have seen the path of the myth before," Ursua told him. "You will remind us of God." Alvaro only smiled. "God has not been seen on that path for many years." They departed from Lima in the season of storms, sailing up the coast before cutting east into the jungle. The sun beat down like a hammer. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds so thick the men wrapped their faces in cloth. Still they marched, dragging boats overland toward the river they called Marañón. The jungle devoured them slowly. The air itself felt heavy, sweet with rot. Men cursed the vines that clawed at their ankles and the rain that turned every step into mud. Fever came next, a silent thief. Within weeks, half their number had died. At night, the survivors huddled beside small fires, listening to the river mutter in the dark. Father Alvaro read from his Bible, though even his voice seemed to fade beneath the endless hum of insects. Aguirre sat apart, eyes glinting. "Do you hear it?" he whispered once to Alvaro. "The river speaks. What does it say?" the priest asked. "It says we will find what others feared to see." When they finally reached the banks of the Marañón, the men cheered weakly. They built rafts from tree trunks and set sail into the unknown. The current was swift, the water brown and thick with debris. Every bend promised ambush. Father Alvaro wrote, "We drift between hunger and hallucination. The men dream of gold, of women made of light, of the city that glitters in every droplet of water. Aguirre dreams louder than all." Ursua tried to keep discipline, but the jungle listened to no commander. The men whispered that their leader was cursed, that God had abandoned them. When Ursua ordered them to turn back, Aguirre refused. "The city is ahead," he said. "I can smell it in the wind." One night, a shot cracked through the trees. Ursua fell, his chest blooming red. No one saw who fired. Aguirre stepped over the body and said calmly, "The command is mine now." No one argued. Under Aguirre, the expedition changed shape. He declared himself Prince of El Dorado and swore vengeance on the King of Spain. "We have been cast aside," he told the men. "Forgotten by our empire, abandoned by God, so we shall make a new empire here, in the land of gold." His voice was mesmerizing, low and fervent. The soldiers who had once prayed now shouted his name. They built banners from torn shirts and painted a crude sun in the center. Father Alvaro tried to reason with him. "You cannot wage war on heaven," he said. Aguirre smiled. "Heaven is a country for cowards." From then on, madness spread like fever. They attacked every village they passed, claiming to seek provisions but leaving ruin. Smoke followed them downriver. Aguirre kept a diary in a neat, elegant hand, beginning each entry with the same words: "I, Lope de Aguirre, the wrath of God." The farther they travelled, the stranger he became. He spoke to shadows, held court with invisible kings. At dawn, he stood at the prow of his raft and whispered sermons about liberation and destiny. His followers listened, spellbound. One morning, a soldier tried to desert. Aguirre ordered him tied to a tree at the water's edge, where the rising tide would drown him. "The river will decide his faith," he said. The man screamed until the jungle swallowed his voice. Father Alvaro confronted him afterward. "You damn these men with every breath." Aguirre looked at him with pity. "You of all people should understand. You've seen what faith becomes when men hide behind it. I am its purest form, the fire that burns away the lies." Alvaro stared into the river. "You call yourself God's wrath, but you are only man's." Then perhaps man is all that God ever was, Aguirre replied. They reached the confluence with the Orinoco after months of drifting. Only a few dozen remained. Their clothes hung in rags. Their skin was streaked with sores. Hunger had carved them into ghosts. Aguirre announced that they would settle there, build their capital, the new El Dorado. He ordered huts raised, walls of mud, a crude throne carved from a fallen tree. He crowned himself with a band of gold filched from a village altar. The men cheered weakly, too broken to resist. Father Alvaro stood beside him during the ceremony, forced to bless the act. He lifted his trembling hand and muttered the words, though his heart was silent. That night, rain hammered the camp. The huts collapsed. The men huddled beneath their cloaks, whispering prayers to a god they no longer believed in. In the morning, they found 3 soldiers dead, throats cut, bodies left in the mud. Aguirre declared them traitors and ordered their heads placed on stakes. The priest tried to bury the bodies. Aguirre stopped him. They wanted to leave, he said. Now they belong to the land. The killings continued. A glance, a murmur, a hesitation. Any of these could be death. Aguirre moved through the camp like a fever dream, his eyes bright with madness. One evening he gathered the men. The crown of Spain will come for us, he said. They will send armies. We will meet them with fire. Our empire will stretch from river to sea. Father Alvaro stepped forward. There is no empire, he said quietly. There is only you and the echo of your hunger. Aguirre stared at him for a long time. Then he laughed. Perhaps. But echoes last longer than prayers. He turned and walked away. Days later, the priest found a small group of soldiers preparing to flee. They begged for his blessing. He gave it, knowing they would never survive the jungle. That night, Aguirre discovered their absence. Who knew of this? He demanded. No one spoke. He drew his sword. The blade flashed in the torchlight. Then you all did. The massacre that followed lasted until dawn. When it was over, the river ran red. Father Alvaro wrote his final entry. The wrath of God walks among us, wearing a man's face. At last, even Aguirre's madness began to turn inward. He spoke less, slept little, stared for hours at the water as if waiting for it to speak again. One morning, his daughter Elvira, barely 16, approached him. Father, she said, we must leave. The soldiers will kill us. Aguirre looked at her gently, almost lovingly. They cannot kill us, he said. We are already immortal. That night, he took her life with a single stroke, whispering a prayer as she fell. When the remaining soldiers saw what he had done, they turned on him. The first bullet missed. The second struck his chest. He staggered, smiled, and whispered, I am the wrath of God, before collapsing into the mud. The jungle swallowed the sound. Weeks later, when Father Alvaro was rescued by a passing patrol, he was little more than a shadow. He said almost nothing of what had happened, only that the river keeps its own dead. He returned to Spain years later, carrying Aguirre's diary. It was written in a beautiful, meticulous hand, each page filled with declarations of divinity, promises of empire, and verses of poetry about fire and gold. The Inquisition burned it, calling it heresy. But Alvaro had already copied a few lines into his own journal. God did not create man in his image. Man created God in the image of his hunger. And so I, Lope de Aguirre, am his truest disciple. In his old age, Alvaro would speak of Aguirre only once. To a novice who asked why he stayed so long, he said, because someone had to witness what faith becomes when it loses its soul. The novice asked, was he evil? Alvaro shook his head. He was pure. That was the danger, the river remembers. Even now, the locals call a bend in the Orinoco El Paso del Demonio, the Devil's Crossing. They say that when storms rise and lightning splits the sky, a man's voice can be heard shouting from the waves. I am the wrath of God. Some claim to see a figure walking upon the water, pale as ash, crowned with gold. Others swear it is only the moon reflected in the current. But Father Alvaro knew better. He knew that once a man believes himself divine, he cannot die, because the story will keep breathing for him. And in the endless jungle night, where the trees whisper and the rivers glisten like mirrors, Lope de Aguirre still reigns, king of nothing, prophet of madness, the living proof that El Dorado was never a city of gold, but the kingdom of man's own damnation. The mountain air was thin again. thin enough that every breath felt borrowed. After decades of searching rivers and jungles, the legend had circled back to its cradle, the Lake of Guatavita. The Spaniards had returned, carrying with them ropes, pulleys, and shovels instead of prayers. They came not to worship but to wound. The year was 1580. A new expedition, led by Antonio de Sepulveda, had arrived from Bogotá, obsessed with the same old rumor, that beneath the lake's dark skin slept the treasure of El Dorado. Sepulveda was no soldier, but an engineer, a man who believed in mathematics, not myths. Every lake has a bottom, he said, and every bottom can be reached. Father Alvaro Ruiz, now stooped and grey, stood on the shore among the crowd of workmen and soldiers. He had been summoned not as priest, but as chronicler, the keeper of memory. "You saw the ceremony, did you not?" they asked. "Then tell us where they dropped the gold." He told them nothing. He simply watched the water, still, perfect, unbroken. The lake had not changed. Mist drifted across its surface. Sunlight slid down the surrounding cliffs like molten glass. To Alvaro, it seemed as if time itself had chosen this place to rest. Yet now, shouts echoed across the shore as men drove stakes into the mud and began to dig trenches. They worked day and night. Buckets passed hand to hand, draining the shallows. They carved a channel into the hillside, hoping to bleed the lake dry. When water rushed through the trench, the men cheered. Sepulveda raised his arms. "At last the gods will speak," Father Alvaro whispered. "They already have. We just never learned their language." For months the work continued. The trench deepened, the water lowered by a few feet, revealing slopes of sticky mud. Men waded into it, searching with bare hands. They found fragments, tiny golden frogs, a sun disk, an emerald bead, proof enough to drive them mad. Every glittering speck was lifted with shouts of victory, paraded like trophies. "This is only the beginning," Sepulveda declared. "The rest lies deeper." Alvaro felt dread coil inside him. He knew how stories worked. Every fragment of truth fed 1,000 lies. He walked the perimeter of the lake each morning, listening to the hiss of water in the trenches. The sound reminded him of breathing, laboured, weakening. At night, the workers gathered around fires, their faces ghostly in the flickering light. They told stories of the Golden King, of the priestess who guarded the lake, of voices that whispered beneath the surface. Some claimed they saw lights moving under the water, like candles drifting in a cathedral. Alvaro wrote in his journal, "They dig as if opening a grave, and perhaps they are." One dawn, a young engineer approached him. "Father," he said, "I heard you were there, years ago, when the Golden One bathed in the lake. Tell me, did it happen?" Alvaro studied the boy's face, bright, hopeful, untouched by failure. "Yes," he said softly, "it happened, but not the way you think." "Then what was it?" "A promise," the priest replied. "Between light and darkness, between man and what he cannot own." The boy frowned. "And the gold?" "It was never the treasure," Alvaro said. "It was the language." Weeks passed. The rains returned early. Water poured down the slopes, flooding the trenches. The engineers tried to reinforce the barriers with logs and stones, but the current tore them apart. In one night, half the work of 6 months vanished. Sepulveda raged. "We will drain it again!" he shouted. "If we have to move the mountain, we will." But the men were tired. They whispered that the lake was alive, that it was defending itself. 2 labourers drowned when a trench wall collapsed. Another vanished, his footprints ending abruptly at the edge of the mud. Father Alvaro stood at the water's edge, watching ripples close over the spot. "You cannot take what was given," he murmured. That night, as thunder rolled through the mountains, he dreamed of Anaya. She stood before him, unchanged, her eyes reflecting the stars. "You told them, didn't you?" she asked. "I tried to stop them," he said. "You should have let it rest. They would never rest." She looked past him toward the horizon, where fires flickered from the camps. "Then neither will the lake." When he woke, the storm had ended. The trenches were full again. The surface of the lake gleamed silver under the rising sun, as if nothing had ever happened. Sepulveda refused to yield. He ordered the water drained once more, this time using explosives to blast a wider channel. The explosion shattered the morning calm, echoing through the valley. Rocks tumbled, trees splintered, mud rained from the cliffs. The engineers cheered until the slope beneath them began to slide. The hillside collapsed into the lake with a roar. Waves surged outward, smashing boats and drowning men. When the water stilled again, it was higher than before, as if mocking their effort. Among the wreckage, Alvaro found the young engineer, the boy who had asked about the ceremony. His face was pale, his hand still clutching a piece of gold no larger than a coin. Alvaro pried it free and dropped it into the water. "You belong here," he whispered. That evening, Sepulveda sat by the shore, his confidence gone. "You've seen this lake more times than anyone," he said to Alvaro. "Why does it defy us?" "Because it remembers," the priest replied. "Remembers what?" "The day we stopped listening." Sepulveda laughed bitterly. "You speak like a native." "I speak like a man who has watched too many mirrors crack," Alvaro said. As weeks turned to months, the expedition collapsed. Supplies ran out. Sickness spread. One by one, the workers deserted. The trenches filled completely. The lake rose to its old level, serene and untouched. On the final day, Sepulveda ordered the last raft burned. "We'll leave nothing behind," he said. The flames licked the water, hissing and dying in clouds of smoke. Father Alvaro turned away. He climbed the slope above the lake, where the wind swept clean. From there, he looked down upon the valley, the circle of water gleaming like an eye, unblinking, eternal. He felt the weight of his years press upon him. The world had changed, but the lake had not. Kings had risen and fallen. Empires had bled themselves dry, and still the mirror remained. He opened his journal and wrote, "Men believe the lake hides gold. They are wrong. It hides their reflection, and that is what terrifies them." That night, he dreamt again. This time he stood on the surface of the water. The stars above were mirrored below, and he walked between two heavens. From the depths rose faint shapes, tunjos of gold, idols of frogs and suns, all drifting upward like bubbles of light. Anaya appeared beside him. "Do you see now?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "It was never about the gold." "It never is," she said. "They think the gods demand treasure. But the gods only ask for memory." The idols began to sink again, swallowed by darkness. "Where do they go?" he asked. "To where all prayers go," she said. Back to silence. When he woke, dawn was breaking. The mist lay low over the lake, soft as breath. A few days later, Sepulveda left with the last of his men, muttering about the futility of faith and the weight of failure. Father Alvaro remained. He built a small hut by the shore and stayed through the winter, writing what he remembered of the old rituals. He grew weaker with each passing week, but peace found him there. Sometimes, in the stillness of morning, he thought he heard flutes, distant, echoing from beneath the surface. At other times, he saw a shimmer like sunlight moving under the water. On his final day, he wrote, "The lake does not speak because it has already answered. We were too loud to hear it." He closed the journal and laid it beside him. As the sun reached the horizon, a wind stirred the surface of Guatavita. For a moment, the reflection of the sky fractured into 1,000 shards of light, each one catching the fire of the sun. To anyone watching, it might have looked as if the lake were breathing again, one long sigh after centuries of waiting. And when the light faded, there was only stillness. Years later, travelers would visit the site. They would speak of the strange quiet, the feeling of being watched. Some claimed that if you stood at the edge of the lake at sunrise, you could see a golden figure standing in the mist, holding out his hands as if to offer the world back to itself. No one ever found treasure. The lake gave nothing more. Yet the stories continued, polished smooth by centuries, passed from mouth to mouth until they gleamed brighter than any metal. And in every telling, the lake remained the same, silent, patient, unbroken. It was said that if you whispered your desire into its reflection and waited for the ripples to fade, the lake would answer, not with words but with truth. For most, that truth was too heavy to bear. For others, it was enough. At dusk, when the wind died and the mountains turned purple, the surface of Guatavita mirrored the sky so perfectly that no one could tell where one world ended and the other began. In that fragile symmetry, everything, the heavens, the earth, the forgotten prayers of men, merged into a single, breathless image, and the lake, which would not speak, kept its silence, because silence, Father Alvaro had once written, was the language of the divine. The ink spread like veins across parchment. In a candlelit chamber in Bogotá, Antonio de Berrio leaned over his desk, tracing the outline of a continent that seemed to shift every time he looked away. On the paper, rivers twisted like serpents, mountains rose and disappeared, and in the heart of the unknown, he He wrote a single word. Manoa. Outside, the rain lashed the windows. The city slept, but Berrio did not. He was an old man now, grey, brittle, but still possessed by the fever that had outlived kings. He had heard the stories from soldiers, traders, priests. El Dorado had escaped every hand that reached for it. But to him, the failure of others was proof of its existence. A thing pursued so long, he murmured, must exist or God is a liar. He dipped his quill again. The ink bled into the shape of a great lake, the fabled Parim, and on its shore he marked a golden circle. Around it he wrote in careful script, City of Manoa, capital of the Golden Empire. At the edge of the room, Father Alvaro Ruiz sat quietly, his hands folded over his staff. His hair was white, his eyes dim, yet the old fire still flickered within them. He had been invited by Berrio as consultant, though the priest suspected the man wanted not counsel, but validation. You have seen the lake, Berrio said without looking up. I have, Alvaro replied. Then you know it hides gold. I know it hides truth. Truth is nothing without proof, Berrio said. Maps are proof, Alvaro sighed. Maps are only mirrors for the blind, Berrio smiled. Then let us see what blindness discovers. Weeks later, they departed from Bogotá with 200 men, mules laden with provisions, and bundles of parchment rolled in waxed leather. Berrio carried them as sacred relics. The world will remember the man who finishes the map, he told his officers. They marched east through forests that whispered with rain. The road narrowed, then vanished. The jungle thickened into a green labyrinth. By the third week, half the mules were dead, and the men cursed the captain's vision. Father Alvaro travelled in silence, writing by firelight each night. We draw the world to make it smaller, to cage what terrifies us. But the world refuses to stay still. They reached the Orinoco in midsummer. The river spread before them wide and brown, its surface broken by whirlpools. Berrio ordered the men to build rafts and sail downstream. Each mile we travel will give birth to a new line on the map, he said. Each bend will become a name. As they drifted, Father Alvaro sat with his journal open on his knees. You think you make discovery, he told Berrio, but you only redraw the same hunger in new ink. Berrio ignored him. History is written by those who move forward. History is written by those who survive, Alvaro said. After 2 months, they arrived at a wide valley ringed by distant hills. The air shimmered with heat. At its center lay a shallow basin filled with reeds and fog. The guides called it the Eye of the World. This must be Parim, Berrio declared, the lake the natives spoke of. They camped on the shore for 3 days, but the fog never lifted. The men refused to enter the water, claiming spirits moved beneath the surface. At night they heard drums echoing from the far side. On the 4th morning, Berrio awoke to find the fog gone and the basin empty, a dry plain of cracked mud. The lake has fled, one soldier muttered. Berrio knelt and pressed his hand to the earth. No, he said, it has hidden itself from unbelievers. Father Alvaro watched him with pity. You make gods out of illusions, he said. Berrio looked up. And you make illusions out of gods. They continued east. Every village they passed fed new lines to Berrio's map. Rivers bent where he needed them. Mountains shifted to fit his theory. When a tribe told him of a shining city far beyond the horizon, he smiled triumphantly. You see, the stories agree, Alvaro asked. Did you listen to what else they said? They said the city is rich. They also said it floats in the clouds, Alvaro reminded him. Then perhaps we must learn to fly. By autumn, sickness spread through the camp. Men coughed blood and slept in fever. The jungle buzzed with flies, the smell of rot thick in the air. Berrio continued to chart, oblivious. He drew not what he saw, but what he needed to see. At night, Alvaro found him hunched over his parchment, painting the golden city by the light of a single candle. The drawing shimmered with promise. Spires of flame, walls of sun, streets paved with radiance. You're making scripture, the priest said. Berrio smiled thinly. All maps are scripture. They tell men where heaven lies. Or hell. There is no difference, Berrio said. Only direction. When winter came, the river flooded. Their camp was swallowed overnight. Men clung to trees, screaming as the current tore through. Alvaro and Berrio escaped by raft, carrying what maps they could save. The rest were lost to the water. When dawn broke, the flood receded, leaving the forest strewn with wreckage. Berriot stared at the soggy scraps of parchment in his hands, the ink running like blood. Everything I drew, he whispered. The river erased. Then perhaps it was not yours to draw, Alvaro said gently. But Berriot refused to accept defeat. We will start again, he said. We will find Paraim, even if it kills us. Months later, the survivors stumbled into a clearing where the air shimmered with heat and light. Before them stretched an enormous body of water, golden under the sun. The men fell to their knees. Berriot wept. The lake, he said. Lake Paraim. The map was right! Father Alvaro shaded his eyes. He saw not a lake, but a vast mirage. Sunlight caught on endless fields of sand, rippling with heat. The men ran forward, shouting with joy. Their feet sank into dry earth. The lake vanished. Berriot fell to the ground, hands clawing the dust. No, he cried. It was here. Alvaro knelt beside him. It was never here, he said softly. You made it so. Berriot struck the ground again. Then what have I done all these years? You have drawn a world that believes in itself, Alvaro said. Berriot looked up, tears streaking the dirt on his face. Then I am a god. The priest's voice was almost tender. No, Antonio, you are a cartographer. When they finally returned to civilization, if the broken outpost on the river's edge could be called that, Berriot presented his final map to the governor. The parchment was patched, smudged, but breathtaking. Mountains carved like wounds, rivers glittering like veins, and at the center, a great blue lake with a city of gold upon its shore. Here it is, he said, the truth. The governor stared at it for a long moment, then nodded. It will serve. And so, without question, the map was copied and sent to Spain. Within a year, it appeared in atlases across Europe. Scholars debated the coordinates of Lake Paraim. Artists painted Manoa as paradise. And the legend of El Dorado gained new life. Father Alvaro returned to his monastery. He hung one of the maps on his wall, a gift from Berriot signed in trembling hand. Each evening, as the sunset gilded the parchment, he would study its lines, trying to see the truth beneath the lies. One night, a young novice entered. Father, he asked, is the city real? Alvaro smiled faintly. It is as real as the map. Then the map is false. The map is true, the priest said. It just doesn't show the world. It shows us. The boy frowned, confused. I don't understand. You will, Alvaro said. One day, when you draw your own map. Years later, after Alvaro's death, the brothers found his final entry written on the back of Berriot's chart. Every map begins as a prayer. We draw not to find the world, but to summon it. The more we believe in the lines, the more real they become. And thus the city of gold will exist forever. Not in the earth, but in the imagination of those who cannot stop searching. Centuries would pass before explorers discovered that Lake Paraim did not exist. Yet on maps, it remained. An elegant blue stain on parchment, beautiful in its persistence. Even when the scientists erased it, the people still spoke its name. Children traced it with their fingers, dreaming of shining towers and golden streets. Poets called it the lake that lived only on paper. And somewhere, in that fragile space between ink and faith, between what is drawn and what is real, the city of Manoa waited, untouched, unspoiled, eternal. The wind still carries whispers across the old routes of Berriot's expedition. Travelers say that if you hold a map of Guyana to the light at dawn, the rivers gleam faintly like veins of gold. Perhaps it is only sunlight bleeding through the paper. Or perhaps, as Father Alvaro once wrote, belief is the compass that never points north, it points inward. And there, deep in the territory of the unseen, lies the only El Dorado that ever mattered. The sea smelled of rot and salt when the English ships dropped anchor off the coast of Trinidad. The year was 1595. The wind blew from the Orinoco like a hot breath, heavy with mud and rumour. Sir Walter Raleigh, newly freed from the Tower of London and desperate to restore his favour with Queen Elizabeth, stood on the quarterdeck, staring toward the jungle as if he could already see the glitter of Manoa through the haze. Behind him, sailors murmured prayers or curses. The voyage had been long, and the Queen's patience short. Raleigh's orders were simple. Find the Golden Empire Spain could not, and bring home proof that England's sun would never set. Father Alvaro Ruiz, now an old man nearly blind, had been taken prisoner months earlier by Spanish forces in Trinidad, and was rumoured to possess first-hand knowledge of El Dorado. Raleigh's men found him in the custody of Antonio de Berrio, the same man who had drawn the great map of Lake Parime. They took them both. When Raleigh entered the Spanish governor's hall, the two prisoners sat side by side, Berrio gaunt and fevered, Alvaro serene. His white beard falling like frost across his chest, Raleigh bowed slightly. "Gentlemen, forgive the intrusion. I am merely a seeker of truth." Berrio laughed bitterly. "Truth? You come to steal what you cannot imagine." "On the contrary," Raleigh said, "imagination is England's greatest export." He turned to Alvaro. "And you, father, what say you? Is there gold in those rivers?" Alvaro's voice was barely a whisper. "There is gold everywhere, Sir Walter, but it is not the kind you can carry," Raleigh smiled. "Then I shall find the kind that shines in both heaven and hand." A week later, Raleigh seized Berrio's maps and sailed up the Orinoco, dragging the old man and the priest with him. The river stretched wide, the colour of melted bronze. On its banks rose forests so dense they looked like walls. Parrots screamed overhead. The current carried them deeper into a world uncharted and unforgiving. At night, they anchored among mangroves. The English built fires, cooked salted meat, and sang rough songs. Raleigh sat apart, studying Berrio's papers by torchlight. The ink had faded, but the dream was clear. The city of Manoa, shining on the shores of Lake Parime. Berrio spat into the water. "You chase ghosts." "And yet you drew them," Raleigh said. "I drew what men needed to believe," the Spaniard answered. "Then perhaps belief is all we ever need," Raleigh said. "Faith in what might be, that is what builds empires." Father Alvaro listened, his eyes reflecting the flames. "Faith built this jungle too," he said softly. "And now it devours you." Days passed. The river grew stranger. Once, they saw a village abandoned in haste, cooking pots still smoking. Another day, they found a stone idol half buried in sand, a man's face with the body of a serpent, its eyes inlaid with gold. The English hacked it free, shouting victory. Raleigh held it aloft. "Behold proof." Alvaro shook his head. "Proof of nothing. You mistake the warning for the prize." That night, a storm rolled across the river. The wind tore sails, rain fell like nails. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the jungle in flashes of silver. In the chaos, one of the ships broke loose and vanished into the darkness. By morning, half their food was gone. Raleigh refused to turn back. "The city is near," he told the crew. The Spaniards were too blind to find it. Berrio laughed through cracked lips. "And you think you are different?" "I think I am chosen," Raleigh said. "So did we all," the Spaniard replied. For weeks they pressed onward. The men grew gaunt, their skin peeled by the sun. Fever struck. Some swore they saw golden towers glinting through the mist at dawn. Others claimed to hear bells beneath the water. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, they reached a vast marsh where the river split into 100 silver threads. The air shimmered with heat. Beyond the reeds something glittered. A reflection, a mirage, a promise. Raleigh ordered the boats forward. The water grew shallow. The oars scraped mud. Then they saw it. Shapes rising through the haze, tall and luminous, like walls covered in light. The men cried out, "Manoa!" Someone shouted. Raleigh's heart surged. He leapt into the water, wading toward the vision. But with each step, the towers dissolved. The golden light was only the sun mirrored in a sheet of flooded grass. The city melted into air. Behind him, Father Alvaro's voice carried over the water. "The map is true," he said. "It shows what you most desire." Raleigh sank to his knees. The water reached his chest, warm as blood. Around him, the men fell silent. The world was still except for the hum of insects. He turned to the priest. "Then tell me, Father, what is it that you desire?" Alvaro looked toward the sinking sun. Silence. That night, they made camp on a small island of dry ground. The air smelled of smoke and despair. Berrio coughed blood into his hands. Raleigh sat beside him. "You drew a lie," he said. "I drew hope," Berrio answered. "Hope and lies share the same ink." "And what of the priest?" Raleigh asked. "Was he your witness or your warning?" Berrio smiled faintly. "Both. You'll learn." Hours later, the old Spaniard died. They buried him at the edge of the island, beneath a cross fashioned from oars. Raleigh stood over the grave. "He was a dreamer," he said. Father Alvaro corrected him. "He was a believer." "Is there a difference?" "Only in what survives you," the priest said. They journeyed farther east until the river widened into an inland sea. The water reflected the sky so perfectly that the horizon vanished. The men rode through clouds. unsure whether they sailed on water or air. Then, from the far shore, voices drifted, soft chanting, rhythmic as waves. Through the mist appeared canoes carved from a single tree, each carrying figures draped in feathers and gold. The strangers approached silently. Their leader, an elder with painted eyes, spoke in a language none of the English understood. Raleigh stepped forward. "We come in peace," he said, spreading his arms. The elder looked at Alvaro. "He asks why you chase what cannot be held," the priest translated. "Tell him we seek Manoa," Raleigh said. Alvaro hesitated, then spoke the words. The elder smiled, sad and knowing. He lifted a handful of river water and let it fall through his fingers. "Manoa," he said in halting Spanish. "Here," Raleigh frowned. "The river?" "The reflection," Alvaro whispered. "He means the reflection." The elder's eyes met Raleigh's. "Those who search too long forget which world they live in." Then he turned and paddled away, his people vanishing into the mist like ghosts. Raleigh stood on the deck long after night fell, staring at the river. The water was calm, perfectly still. In its mirror, he saw the stars, thousands of them, shining like scattered coins. He whispered, "So much gold, and none of it mine." Father Alvaro, sitting beside him, smiled faintly. "Perhaps that is mercy." Raleigh looked at the old man. "If you could go back," he said, "to the first lake, to the first golden king, would you stop it all from beginning?" Alvaro's eyes were distant. "No, because men need something to chase. Without that, they would see themselves too clearly." Weeks later, their provisions ran out. Fever returned. The men mutinied, begging Raleigh to turn back. He finally agreed, though his pride cracked with the decision. "We will return," he swore. "The city is real. I have seen it." When they reached the sea again, the survivors were skeletons. Of the 200 who had left England, barely 40 remained. Yet Raleigh carried with him Berrio's map, the idol from the riverbank, and his own memory of a city made of light. He wrote furiously during the voyage home, filling page after page. In his cabin, Father Alvaro watched him. "You will tell them the truth?" he asked. "I will tell them what they need," Raleigh said. "And what do they need?" "Wonder," he said. "England needs wonder." When they reached London, Raleigh presented his manuscript to the Queen, The Discovery of Guyana. In it, he described fertile lands, endless rivers, and a city richer than any on earth. He spoke of golden kings and sunlit temples, of a people who worshipped the dawn. It was all a lie, or perhaps, as Berrio once said, a kind of hope. The book spread across Europe like wildfire. Maps redrew themselves overnight. Scholars marked Lake Parime as fact, and the world once again tilted toward the glittering illusion of El Dorado. Father Alvaro's name appeared only once, a passing reference to a Spanish friar who confirmed the legend. He was already dead when the book was published. His last journal entry read, "He found the city at last, inside the word itself. El Dorado has no walls, no streets, no gold. It is the sound of desire spoken aloud." Years later, Raleigh would return to the Orinoco one final time, his hair silver, his faith undimmed. He would lose his son, his crew, and finally his head. Yet in his final moments, before the axe fell, he would smile and whisper, "I have seen it." The crowd thought he meant the city, but perhaps he meant the reflection, the golden light upon the river that was never real, yet always true, and somewhere in the jungles of Guyana, the Orinoco still carries his echo, blending with the songs of birds and the murmur of the current. When the sun sets and the water turns to fire, travelers say they can see for an instant the outline of shining towers rippling across the surface, just enough to make the heart believe. Then the image fades, leaving only the river and the sky, two mirrors facing each other, endlessly reflecting a dream that refuses to die. Centuries had passed since the last expedition vanished into the jungle. The maps had changed, the names had shifted, but the myth remained, glimmering beneath the surface of the modern world like a coin buried in dust. In 1898, London was a city of soot and glass, of gaslight and progress. The air smelled of coal and ambition. Trains howled beneath the streets. Factories pulsed like metal hearts. And in every gentleman's club, men in waistcoats argued over empire. It was there, in a smoky parlour on Fleet Street, that Professor Edmund Hargreaves unfolded a yellowed parchment before a small audience of explorers and investors. The map was centuries old, edges frayed, ink fading, but its centre still gleamed with a single name, Manoa. "Gentlemen," Hargreaves said, his voice crisp with excitement, "you are looking at the last surviving copy of Sir Walter Raleigh's personal chart of Guiana. The lake, the city, the route, all here. The dream of El Dorado preserved for 300 years. The men leaned closer. Candlelight danced on their polished boots. Someone laughed nervously. "A fairy tale," muttered one. Hargreaves smiled. "Then let us prove it false, or prove it true. Either way, the world will remember our names." Among those present was Clara Whitestone, the only woman in the room, a journalist for the Illustrated Chronicle. Her editor had sent her to report on another foolish expedition into nowhere. But as she watched Hargreaves trace his finger across the faded lines, she felt something stir, curiosity, maybe longing. Later, when the men dispersed, she approached him. "You believe this map is real?" He glanced up from the parchment. "Belief is irrelevant. The question is whether the myth still has somewhere left to hide." Clara tilted her head. "And if it doesn't? Then we shall invent a new one," he said. She smiled. "Then I'm coming with you." 2 months later, the expedition departed from Liverpool aboard the Erebus II. The ship carried scientists, soldiers, photographers, and crates of equipment labelled Royal Geographic Society. Among them were Hargreaves, his assistant Miles, and Clara, disguised as the Society's official documentation officer. They reached the coast of Venezuela after 6 weeks at sea. The port was a tangle of heat and flies. Steamships belched smoke, and local traders shouted in Spanish and Dutch. Hargreaves stood on the dock, holding Raleigh's map against the sunlight. "We follow the Orinoco," he said, "to the source, to the truth." Clara scribbled in her notebook. "He speaks of truth the way men speak of gold, something to be mined, melted, owned." Their journey inland was relentless. The jungle had changed little since the time of the conquistadors, green, endless, alive. Steam engines had replaced mules, rifles replaced swords, but the land did not care. One by one, the machines broke. Gears jammed, belts snapped, fuel ran dry. They reverted to canoes, paddling up the same brown river that had swallowed men for 4 centuries. At night, Clara developed her photographs by lantern light. The images blurred, the film fogged in the humidity, as if the jungle refused to be captured. Hargreaves studied the river with feverish eyes. "Do you see?" he whispered. "Even the stars here are different. It's as though we've crossed into another sky." Clara replied, "Maybe the sky has always been different. We just never looked long enough." Weeks passed. They met tribes who had never seen a steam engine, and others who spoke fragments of Spanish older than any empire. One elder told them of a lake that vanished each season, leaving behind a plain of mirrors. Another warned that to look too long into its reflection was to lose one's face. The men laughed. Hargreaves smiled politely and wrote it down. Clara, however, couldn't stop thinking about it. That night she asked him, "Do you ever wonder why every version of El Dorado ends in water?" He frowned. "Because gold sinks," she shook her head. "Because water remembers." One evening, while the men set up camp, Clara wandered to the riverbank. The sun was setting, and the water shimmered like molten metal. In that glow, she saw faint outlines beneath the surface. Shapes that looked like towers. She blinked, and they were gone. When she told Hargreaves, his eyes lit up. "Then we're close. Might it have been a trick of light?" she asked. He smiled thinly. "All revelations are tricks of light." The following days were chaos. A fever swept through the crew. Miles died first, then 3 soldiers. The survivors grew restless. Hargreaves refused to stop. "Every step we take is history," he said. Clara tried to reason with him. "You're killing them for a rumor. I'm saving them from insignificance," he replied. "Don't you see? If we find Manoa, we find eternity." That night, lightning struck the camp. Fire spread through the tents. In the confusion, the map caught flame. Clara managed to snatch it from the blaze, but half of it turned to ash in her hands. Hargreaves fell to his knees. "No!" he screamed. "That was our compass." Clara stared at the surviving piece, a small section showing only the outline of a river that ended abruptly in blank parchment. "Maybe," she said softly, "it's time to stop following other people's maps." They pressed on until the river narrowed into a gorge. The sound of waterfalls filled the air. mist rose from the cliffs like smoke. And there, at the base of the cataract, the water widened into a basin, a vast, circular lake reflecting the clouds. Guatavita, Clara whispered. Hargreaves stumbled forward, boots sinking into the mud. No, he breathed. It can't be. He waded into the water, laughing, crying. Do you see it? The light. Look, look. Clara saw only ripples in sky, but for a heartbeat, she thought she glimpsed something beneath the surface. Golden shapes moving slowly, like fish made of sunlight. Hargreaves reached deeper, his hands trembling. It's here, he said. It's all here. Then the mud gave way. He vanished beneath the surface. Clara screamed, plunging after him, but the water swallowed him whole. When it stilled again, there was no trace, no bubbles, no body, only the reflection of the sun, blinding and endless. She waited until nightfall. The moon rose, silvering the lake. In its mirror, she thought she saw him again. Hargreaves, standing on the water, arms outstretched, a faint smile on his face. She blinked, and he was gone. Clara sat on the shore, soaked and shaking. She opened her notebook and wrote, "He found it, I think. The city of light. It took him, as it has taken all who believed too deeply." In the morning, she buried what remained of the map and left. Months later, she returned to London alone. The expedition was declared a failure. Newspapers called it another folly of the age. Her editor demanded a story, and she gave him one. The headline read, "El Dorado found in the mirror of man." The article told of rivers that reflected gold, of explorers blinded by their own dreams, of a priest who once said that the city was made not of metal, but of memory. Readers called it poetic nonsense, yet the article spread faster than any true discovery. Copies sold across Europe. Artists painted the city again, shining, unreachable, eternal. Clara became famous for a time, but fame, like gold, tarnished quickly. She grew old, her eyesight dimming, her hands trembling as she wrote her final book, The Cartography of Desire. In its final chapter, she wrote, "Every age rediscovers El Dorado because every age forgets what it already has. We are all explorers of reflection, drawn not to the gold itself, but to the shimmer that reminds us we are alive." On her deathbed, she asked to see her old photographs from the Orinoco. A nurse fetched the stack, faded, cracked, ghosts of light and shadow. Clara lifted one to her eyes. In the picture, she saw a lake surrounded by mist. At first, nothing unusual, but as she looked closer, she noticed faint lines within the reflection. Arches, spires, the silhouette of a city. She smiled faintly. "There you are," she whispered. Then she closed her eyes. Decades later, when her belongings were catalogued for a museum, the curators dismissed the photographs as artifacts of light exposure. But one intern, examining the negatives, swore the pattern was too deliberate. He traced the lines, overlaying them on a modern satellite image of Venezuela, the shapes aligned with the river's course, forming an almost perfect circle, like the outline of a vanished lake. The intern smiled, whispering the old word as if it were a prayer. Manoa. Outside the museum, London's glass towers glowed like molten gold in the setting sun. Their reflections shimmered in the Thames, endless, rippling, alive. Somewhere in those reflections, between smoke and sky, past and present, the legend still breathed, patient as ever, and the city of gold, born from fire, ink, and longing, continued to shine, not beneath the earth, not under water, but within the mirror of every age that dares to believe. The jungle was no longer green. From the air it looked grey and wounded, a patchwork of deforested scars. Helicopters thundered across the horizon, carrying scientists and soldiers, journalists and drones. In the year 2025, the myth had become data, a digital obsession. At the heart of the project was Dr. Elena Ruiz, an archaeologist born in Bogotá and raised on stories of her ancestor, Father Álvaro Ruiz. She had read his journals as a child, tracing the fragile ink with trembling fingers, memorizing the words that no university dared to teach. El Dorado was never a place. It was a reflection. But now she was here, leading the largest archaeological survey in South America's history. The funding came from corporations, governments, and private donors, all hungry for what she called the last mirage. Her mission brief read, Project Manoa, Remote Sensing and Excavation Protocol 7A. The coordinates glowed on her tablet. 4 de Gran, 62 de Grabio, the supposed location of Lake Paraim. She stared out the helicopter window as they descended. The basin below shimmered with shallow water, sunlight flashing across mud flats. Drones circled, mapping every inch in infrared and LiDAR. "No more myths," said her assistant, Dr. Thomas Hale, a British geologist. "Just measurements," Elena smiled faintly. "That's what they said 400 years ago." The base camp rose quickly. White tents, steel crates, generators humming like bees. At night, the jungle glowed with the soft pulse of LED light. The air smelled of oil and rain. Elena spent her days in the command tent, staring at layers of digital terrain models. The LiDAR scans revealed something strange beneath the floodplain. Perfect geometric patterns. Grids, circles, lines that looked almost too deliberate to be natural. Thomas pointed at the screen. Could be geological, could be archaeological, could be nothing. Or everything, Eleanor said. He chuckled. "You sound like your ancestor." She looked at him sharply. He wasn't wrong. He just spoke the wrong language. Weeks passed. The drones mapped more anomalies, ring-shaped mounds buried under centuries of sediment, forming a spiral nearly 5 kilometers wide. When overlaid on colonial maps, the pattern aligned perfectly with the supposed outline of Lake Paraim. "It's a city," Thomas whispered. "Or at least the ghost of one." They launched excavation teams. Bulldozers peeled away mud, revealing fragments, pottery, obsidian blades, gold dust too fine to shape by hand. Elena held a handful of it up to the light. "Not treasure," she said. "Offerings." The deeper they dug, the more symmetrical the layout became, avenues radiating outward like rays of a sun. In the center, ground-penetrating radar detected a hollow chamber sealed beneath rock. The camp buzzed. Journalists flew in. Governments demanded access. The internet erupted with headlines. El Dorado found. The lost city of gold emerges from the jungle. Eleanor hated the noise. She stared at the chamber scan, heart pounding. "It's not gold," she murmured. "It's memory." 3 nights before the chamber was opened, a storm hit. Rain hammered the tents, wind tore through cables. The generators failed. In the sudden dark, Elena sat alone in her tent, listening to the rain. She opened Father Alvaro's journal, the same one she had carried since graduate school. The pages were fragile, the ink faded. She turned to the last entry he had written before his death. "The lake does not hide gold. It hides the reflection of the one who looks." Lightning flashed outside. For an instant, she saw her reflection in the water pooling at her feet. Behind her, another shape, tall, cloaked, indistinct. She spun around. Nothing. The rain intensified. She whispered into the dark. "What do you want me to see?" No answer came, only thunder. At dawn, the storm had passed. The camp was a mess, collapsed tents, flooded trenches, but the excavation pit had held. The team prepared to breach the chamber. Thomas stood beside her, soaked and shivering. "You sure about this? It could collapse." Elena nodded. "Everything does eventually." The workers drilled into the rock, the sound echoing like a heartbeat. A gust of cold air escaped from the crack, smelling of earth and time. When they widened the hole, they lowered a camera through. The feed appeared on the monitor, a dark space, walls glittering faintly. As the lens adjusted, gold shapes emerged. Hundreds of small figurines, arranged in circles around a stone dais. And on that dais lay a mask. Not a face of a god, but of a man. Delicate, angular, unmistakably human. The camp erupted in cheers. Thomas stared at the screen. "We've done it," he whispered. "We found it." Eleanor said nothing. She zoomed the image closer. The mask's eyes were hollow, twin mirrors catching the reflection of the camera lens, and, faintly, her own. She turned away. "Seal it back." "What?" Thomas said. "We can't. This is history." "So was every mistake before it," she said quietly. That night, unable to sleep, Eleanor walked alone to the flooded plain. The storm clouds had cleared, leaving a perfect reflection of the sky in the water. Stars shimmered across its surface. She remembered her ancestors' words, her father's stories, the centuries of madness that gold had summoned. Kneeling by the edge, she whispered, "If you are still here, show me." The water rippled. Then, slowly, images formed. ghostly and bright. Men in armor, dragging boats through jungle, a priest standing before a lake, a mad soldier shouting that he was the wrath of God, a map drawn in trembling hands, a woman photographing a mirage. All of them appeared and faded like breath on glass. And then, for the first time, she saw the city. It was not made of metal. It was made of light, bridges of gold fire, towers rising like flames, streets of shifting reflections. In its heart stood a great lake, and within that lake, another city, and within that city, another world. She reached toward it. Her fingers touched the surface. The vision shattered. Behind her, Thomas called out, "Elena, what are you doing?" She turned. Her reflection looked back, but it wasn't hers. The face in the water was older, bearded, wearing the robes of a priest, Father Alvaro. He spoke without sound, lips forming the words she already knew. "You are the mirror now." The wind rose. The stars dissolved. When Thomas reached her, she was standing motionless at the water's edge, eyes open, expression calm. The reflection beneath her feet was gone. Only ripples remained. He called her name again. No answer. By dawn, the rain began to fall. The helicopters came. The news crews arrived. The world waited. But Elena Ruiz was never found. Weeks later, the site was sealed. Governments argued over ownership. Investors sued, and the press turned elsewhere. The chamber beneath the earth was quietly reburied, the coordinates redacted from every map. Thomas returned to London carrying one item, Elena's journal. He opened it on the flight. The last page was blank, except for a single line written in faint ink. The city never wanted to be found. It wanted to remember us. Years passed. Technology advanced. Satellites scanned the earth with impossible precision, mapping every mountain, every hidden ruin. Yet no trace of Manoa ever reappeared. Still, the story endured. In classrooms, documentaries, online forums, people argued about what Elena had seen. Some called it hallucination, others revelation. But sometimes, when satellite photos of the Orinoco Basin were enhanced at dusk, strange patterns glowed in the water, brief, golden geometries that vanished with the next frame. Analysts dismissed them as reflections of the sun, but a few, quietly, began to call them the signal. 100 years later, in a museum in Bogota, a child stood before a display case. Inside, under soft light, lay a fragment of parchment, Raleigh's map, Berrio's handwriting fading to dust. Next to it, a small gold figurine, no larger than a thumb. The child pressed her hand to the glass. For a moment, she thought she saw her reflection shimmer. Not one, but two. Behind her stood a woman with dark eyes and a kind smile, whispering something she couldn't quite hear. When she blinked, the figure was gone. Her mother called from across the hall. "Come on, Lucia. We're leaving!" The girl glanced one last time at the glass. The gold gleamed softly, as though breathing. She whispered the word her teacher had said came from the old tongue. Manoa. And for just a heartbeat, the reflection in the glass seemed to move, forming the faint outline of a shining city, infinite and still. Outside, Bogota's skyscrapers burned gold in the sunset. Cars shimmered in glass windows. Drones buzzed overhead. The city alive with reflections. Somewhere in all that brightness, the old dream lingered. Uncharted, undying El Dorado had not been lost nor found. It had simply changed its shape, slipping from water into glass, from myth into memory, from gold into light. And every time a human face bent toward its own reflection, on a screen, a window, a river, the city awoke, just for an instant to see who was dreaming it this time.